Alrighty, so this is Module 3, the British period in Florida history. This is a 20-year period in which a great deal of history is made. A lot of foundations are laid for future development of Florida. So it's a shorter presentation, but it has a lot of information that I think is very important as we study Florida history. So the first question you have to ask is, how did Britain gain Florida? And this comes out of the 7 Years' War that ran from 1756 to 1763. This is mostly a European war. As usual, the European players have colonies throughout the world. And so, if the mother country is in a state of war, all the colonies and all of the holdings of territory are in the war as well. In terms of North America, we recognize it as the French and Indian War, and so therefore, this portion of the war is what we're more familiar with. Um, Certainly, the French play a major role, but the Indians play an even bigger role because you've got Indians on both sides of this conflict. So France, Holy Roman Empire, Russia, Spain, and other European powers are fighting against Great Britain, Prussia, and then Portugal. So the big key here is that it's pitting France and Spain against Great Britain. Of course, the winner comes out as Great Britain, and as a result, France is going to cede all holdings east of the Mississippi in Canada to Great Britain. It also cedes Louisiana to Spain, which is kind of ironic because Spain was an ally of France. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but just take it for what it's worth. In the last few days of the war, Britain was able to capture Havana in Cuba, the city only, not the island. And so, in order to gain back Havana, Spain agrees to cede all of Florida to Great Britain. So, kind of an interesting fact there that in order to keep the city of Havana, they trade this huge territory of Florida. That's how important Havana is to the Spanish Empire. So looking at the North American British colonial empire, this shows you, of course, our 13 colonies. The area in pink is the area that's gained from the French and Indian War or from the 7 Years' War. You already have some portions of Canada where Britain has holdings. And then you've got Spain kind of on the left-hand side there in that kind of beigey color in the Louisiana Territory. What's interesting about this and something to consider is that coming out of this war, or the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whichever you want to call it, Britain has a very tenuous relationship with the Indians. And so one of the things that they will do is they will try to preserve that relationship with their Indian allies. And one of the ways that they do this, excuse me, is through the Proclamation of 1763. And this is issued by King George III on October 7th. And basically what it does is it creates this dividing line between the American colonies and this area that they've just gained through this war, through the French and Indian War. Well, this is a direct result of an Indian conflict around Michigan, the northern, Northwest Territory, between 1763 and 1766, called Pontiac's Rebellion. It's not really important to go into the detail about it, but it is important to understand the proclamation itself. Basically, all the rivers whose headwaters flowed into the Atlantic Ocean. So if the rivers flowed into the Atlantic Ocean, it was considered available for colonial use. Any of the headwaters that flowed into the Mississippi were for Indians or native use only. The private purchase of Indian land was outlawed. So if any land was purchased by a colony, it had to go through the crown for approval. This meant that the crown gained a monopoly on any future land holdings. And British colonials were forbidden from settling, on native lands, and colonial officials could not grant land without royal approval. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point when it comes to Florida, when you look at West and East Florida, is the fact that this pushes American colonial growth. So one of the big problems that comes out of the French and Indian War with the colonists and their push for independence is that the crown prevents them from being able to move into this Northwest territory, which will be the future states of Indiana and Ohio and Michigan, that they know is very rich farming land. But the crown, the British crown, is very concerned about maintaining this relationship with the Indians and maintaining a good relationship with them. So this means that as a result, they're going to restrict any settlement over the Appalachian Mountains. So basically, if you are a colonist and you're looking to expand or move into territory that isn't already settled, then your only options are pretty much Canada and Florida. And so this is where the importance of this document comes in, is that it forces many people to begin to consider Florida as a potential for settlement when they might otherwise have been focused more on the western area. So, excuse me, Britain basically separates Florida into two territories. This is something that's new. East Florida, of course, with its capital, it's St. Augustine, and its governor will be James Grant. West Florida, with its capital at Pensacola, and it will be, their first governor will be George Johnstone. The dividing line between the two colonies is the Apalachicola River. Now, keep in mind, West Florida runs all the way to essentially the Mississippi. So you've got this territory running literally right up to New Orleans. Of course, this is modern day Alabama, Mississippi, and portions of Louisiana. So Spain is literally right there, right across the river from its old territory. On the map on the left, you'll see an area known as the Northern Territory. This was a portion of land that was in dispute between Britain and Spain at the time, but Britain begins to bring it more into the West Florida sphere, so to speak. So much of the territory of West Florida was to the north in the areas of Mississippi and Alabama. You don't have Americans coming into this territory as of yet, because obviously they're still colonials of the British Crown. But following the American Revolution, and then as we move more towards the War of 1812, Americans begin to understand the value of the land that's in the Northern Territory that will later become Alabama and Mississippi. And these are areas where probably the richest farmland within the South is located. But of course, that has not come to be yet. So looking at East Florida, especially their governor, James Grant, he's from an elite family in Scotland. He serves in the military. He served in the French and Indian War. One of the important aspects of his leadership is the fact that he does not like using militia troops. And this originates out of a battle at Fort Duquesne, which is later will become Pittsburgh, in which he was captured, and he blames the loss of his troops and of the battle on the use of militia troops, that they're just not well trained, they're just not strong enough to handle warfare. But he serves in the 70 Years' War. He actually helps with the capture of Havana in Cuba, which of course precipitates the loss of Florida by the Spanish. And so he's kind of this natural person to fill the slot of governor in 1764. He makes the capital of St. Augustine for the colony. And he begins also to have portions of the colony surveyed. And this is where we get the Florida-Georgia border along the St. Mary's River. He's also known for two other things. One is the Treaty of Fort Piccolata, which we'll talk about in a second. The British, again, remember, they are very focused on building these alliances with Indians and doing everything they can to make sure that those alliances stay solid and that they're on good, solid ground. The other thing that Grant does is he pushes through the construction of what's called the King's Road. And if you're familiar with Jacksonville, you know there's a road called the Old King's Road. That, of course, is part of this road, many, many years later, many versions later. But it ran from St. Augustine to Savannah, and then eventually it does move further south from St. Augustine to the plantations along Pellissier Creek, which is right at the border of Volusia County and St. Johns County. This was important because it could move soldiers very quickly, especially in terms of Indian attacks and future attacks that may take place. This was a great concern to Grant to be able to protect the land. The land grant policy that's in play, this is both for West Florida and East Florida, but a lot of what we'll be talking about is centered around East Florida. But the British used the model of South Carolina for their land grant policy. So many of the things that they are doing, the policies they take or tactics they use, are things that have been tried in South Carolina and have worked. One of the key things to remember about South Carolina is that South Carolina is their planter class, or the planters within that colony, all came from Barbados. Most of them came all at the same time. So they had experienced slave labor prior to moving to North America, and they already had established money. This is an important consideration when you compare Florida to South Carolina, because Florida is not a very wealthy or prosperous colony for Britain, as South Carolina was. But there are three things that they needed to make the land policy successful. And this is according to Governor Grant. You needed land, so Florida still remained a frontier colony. You didn't have a lot of Spanish grants outside of outside of St. Augustine and Pensacola. One of the things we'll talk about is how this plays out in terms of landholders from Spain who stayed within the colony through the British occupation. Not many of them did it. In fact, most of them end up leaving. Grant also firmly believed in slave labor. He did not believe that indentured servants were capable of handling the job that was required to clear and prepare the land. So he very much supported slave labor. And the third thing are ports. In order to make Florida successful, it needed access to ports. The planters needed it, as well as the plantations. St. Augustine was ideal because of its proximity to other British ports to the north. Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia are three, but there are other ports that St. Augustine will be connected to, including New York City. Pensacola, on the other hand, is a deep water port. St. Augustine is not. St. Augustine has a kind of unusual entry into its waterway, which we'll talk about in a second. But Pensacola remains very connected to the British ports in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean. So it is directly related to those. So there's very much a connection to the idea that ports are going to provide access to markets, which they need. South Carolina was a heavy indigo growing colony, as well as rice. Those were their two major cash crops. And so these are the two crops that Florida, under the British period, began to develop. Both of them, indigo and rice, require swampy wetlands, and along the St. Johns River and Apalachicola River, there were abundant wetlands. So these provided natural drainage, and in many cases, it didn't require as much labor to create the channels and canals for the water to flow through. because essentially what you had to do, especially with rice, is you had to create paddies and you had to flood the fields, and then you had to drain them. So it required all of this water, access to water. And of course, in Florida, as we know, it's mostly wetland and low-lying area. Um, Parliament, as well as Florida governors, especially Grant, sought to end what they called the abuse of the land policy. Essentially, what they were trying to prevent from happening are two things: squatters and absentee landowners. So, when we're talking about squatters, these are people who would move through the territory, and they would settle on land that was not being used. So, for example, if you had a land grant for 10,000 acres and the person who owned the land only used 5,000 acres, that left another 5,000 that potentially people could live on for years, possibly, without ever being um, taken off the land or removed. So squatters often would come into the territory, and in Florida, you had cattle that were free range, and so they would raise the cattle, slaughter them for meat or whatever they might need, and they could make a living off of the land without ever having any type of ownership or claim to it. Um, Kind of working hand in hand with that are these absentee landowners. One of the things that Grant did not want to see happen was these landowners who come into Florida gain a large tract of land, like 50,000 acres, and then not do anything with it. What he wanted people to do was he wanted them to come into Florida and cultivate all of the land that they were given. One that was productive for the colony. It meant the colony would be making money, and the tax income would be good. And two, it um, made sure that squatters were not able to squat on the land and basically get a free ride. So when we talk about the squatters, what we have to consider is that these are, in fact, what we will later call crackers in Florida history. These are Anglo-Americans who move into Florida. They set up homes. It might be, a log cabin. It might be a shack. But basically, they come into territory within the interior of the colony. They don't really make um, kind of communications or contact with people. They kind of just live off the land. They're kind of rough people. But this was something that Grant was very much opposed to because he felt like these people were not paying taxes. They were not paying their rightful dues in order to take advantage of the benefits of the colony itself. Um, these absentee landowners, I don't want it to sound like they did not, the British government did not grant land titles to absentee landowners. In fact, that is quite the opposite. They did. In many cases, you had wealthy British men, usually with titles that were given land, or they could purchase it through the British government. They rarely visited the land. They never actually saw it, but they just saw the profits coming from their operations. But they usually hired an agent, and this was an agent who would go in, basically think of them as like a subcontractor that would bring um, slaves, tools, supplies, whatever they needed in order to quote unquote improve the land. In other words, clear it, make it um, where they could, plant seeds and begin to cultivate a crop. And then they would send the bill to the appropriate party who would, of course, get in contact with the landowner, and the landowner would pay the bill. The agent system left a lot to trust. So it was not by chance that many of these landowners would find men out there to serve as an agent. Basically, planters would contact each other and find out who they were using and see if they could hire this agent to come in and set up shop basically and get the plantation going, and then they would move on. There's one agent who's mentioned quite a bit in the plantation records in East Florida, and he literally, his name pops up like almost every other plantation along the St. Johns. So these people were certainly talked about and were recruited basically by word of mouth. You didn't put an ad in the paper. You basically checked with other planters to find out who was reputable and who was most likely to help the plantation get going. But the main thing that Governor Grant, is looking for is he's looking for land to be used. Remember, we talked about the idea of use it or lose it, the res nullis concept from colonization. This is very much what he is in favor of, that as long as the land is being used, chances of it being, of having squatters or, being profitable are greatly increased. Grant had his own plantation. It was called Grant's Villa. That was actually over off of A1A in the Guana State Park area, near where the shell mounds or the shell rings were found. And he used his plantation as a model to show other potential planters or landowners how profitable Florida could be in terms of growing indigo. So it was very common for him to bring visitors to the plantation and show them what was possible. So Parliament required that land be settled by Protestant white families. In other words, Parliament was requiring, or maybe requires a strong word, recommending white indentured servants. There are major cases, or many cases within the historical record where we have letters from plantation owners who complain about the fact that they brought over indentured servants, and within a few weeks or months, they disappear. Parliament wanted to have more Danish and German immigrants. They thought they would work better than British. At the time that all this is going on, keep in mind that Britain has switched over from using indentured servants from Britain to slave labor in other colonies within the American colonies. So they are not referring to British people. They're referring to foreign white Protestant families, Danish and German. Grant believed that white settlers would become disenchanted or lazy by the heat, and therefore would run away at night, which was very common. As I said, it happened quite a bit. But Grant always argued that once the plantation was up and running, at that point was the appropriate time that landowners would begin to use indentured servants. That the upkeep or the initial labor needed to be done by African slaves because they were the ones who could actually handle the work. He also believed that slaves were a solid investment. And of course, this is an argument that can be found throughout different colonies and different slave systems in the Atlantic world, where the natural increase, the concept of natural increase, that being that slaves would have children, was a good investment. So you would try to bring men as well as women onto the plantation so that they could produce children, which would give you a return on your investment. He also argues that slaves were immune to many of the diseases. So yellow fever, which decimated many of the white settlers, he believed that Africans came over with an built-in immunity to many of these diseases. And he also makes the argument, which is kind of callous in many ways, that you don't have to spend a lot of money on slaves. Where an indentured servant, you'd have to provide not only clothing and food, but you'd also have to provide adequate housing. For slaves, he just said, you know what, I just let them do their thing, and they have a thatched hut and a roof. And then during the winter is when I provide extra housing. And so you end up saving a great deal of money. So it's kind of callous of us to look at it like that, but that is kind of how they were thinking. And it, you know, so be it, right? So indigo processing was part of a pretty laborious system. Of course, indigo is a plant. Now, when we go to Kingsley Plantation, we will talk about indigo processing, and it'll give you a better idea of how it works. But essentially, you pull the plant, I think it's like berries or some sort of flower off of the plant. Then you put it into a pool of water. You let the water sit. Basically, it ferments, so it becomes this kind of nasty sludge. And then it moves through, and you can see the pools labeled 6, 7, and 8, where gradually this kind of mixture begins to um, kind of, I don't know where the word is, but it's gradually you work it down to where you get this kind of bluish sludge. And one of the things you have to do, and I believe it's in the pool marked number 8, the next to last pool, where you have to agitate the water. And it was common in during plantation days that if you saw a slave with the lower half of their body with a bluish tint, that meant that they worked on the indigo plantation, because the slaves would have to get into the pool with a mixture of this fermented, smelly, rancid, mixture, and agitate the water, and then they would that would break it down even further. They put like lime into the water, and there was a kind of a chemical concoction that they poured in there with them as they were agitating the water, and it would cause a chemical reaction that would cut into the skin, and so it was very common for slaves to die at an early age if they worked on an indigo plantation and worked around indigo for a while. So it was not a very an easy process by any means. Rice, on the other hand, you can see the images here of cultivating rice. A lot of wetlands. You've got a growing season. Now, keep in mind, you're dealing with mosquitoes and bugs, snakes in the south. In Florida, mosquitoes were just everywhere. So, again, it's not exactly the most wonderful kind of working conditions that you can imagine. So the land grant issues, here's basically what I'm going to come out and say, rather than worry too much about getting into the bulk of it. The British courts began to overturn many of the land grants that Spain presented to Britain at the close of the 7 Years' War. Ideally, according to the Treaty of Paris, Britain would recognize any Spanish claim or any, land grant that Spain had documented. So, if you had a gentleman who, before Spain left, had earned a grant of 1,000 acres, then Britain would recognize that grant for 1,000 acres. However, what Britain does is basically overturn a lot of these. And one of the things that leads to that is the fact that you had so many families in St. Augustine and in the surrounding areas that were leaving at the very end before the British came in, and they signed over their land titles to a man named Jesse Fish. And Jesse Fish worked for a trading company there in St. Augustine. He ended up staying along with one of his co-workers. And so many of the land titles were transferred in his name. And the idea was that if British soldiers or British military men or citizens would come into St. Augustine and buy the land from Jesse, then he would forward the money onto them in Havana. It sounds like a pretty good deal. The problem was it was illegal according to the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris gave the Spanish a window of about like 30, 45 days to rectify any land titles. If they did not, then so be it. It was their fault, and basically land was up for grab. Basically, what the British end up doing is turning down many of Jesse Fish's land titles because they're claiming that they're illegal according to the treaty. So why would the British not want to recognize the Spanish land grants? Basically because a lot of these land grants were huge pieces of land. Most of them were absentee landowners, people who had either left, gone back to Spain, or had gone to Havana. And we'll talk about why they went to Havana in a second. But they wanted to minimize land speculation. And remember, they want to focus on getting the land to be used and not just sit there. And so much of this land that the Spanish had handed out would do just that. And so the British wanted to be able to offer landowners and people who were going to actually use the land the best land possible. And so that is why many of these land grants were turned down. Okay, so within St. Augustine, the Spanish leave, you have about 3,500 subjects with 3 Spanish families staying in the city. So most of the people, 3 Spanish families staying in St. Augustine after the war is pretty small. I mean, 35 out of 3,500 subjects, that's all that stay. So you had about 300 homes in St. Augustine. They're less than 50 years old, mostly one story. The last time St. Augustine was burned to the ground was 50 years ago from that point. So it wasn't in bad shape. Governor Grant, of course, comes in and sees it and thinks he's on some sort of frontier land. Pensacola is worse, but St. Augustine certainly was not in really good shape. Major problems for the colony that kind of plagued the colony during the British occupation, of course, were disease and the high mortality rates. And the portion I want to talk about real quick on this map, and I'm going to try to highlight it, is this area right here. So this is the port. Now, the port that you recognize in St. Augustine today is a modern creation. That was done in the 1960s by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they cut basically a channel through North Beach, Avalano Beach, and Anastasia Island. Prior to that, if you were coming into the harbor, you either came from the south and came north and you had to watch this area that you were traveling through, or you came through another channel from the north heading south, because you had this huge piece of basically a sandbar sitting there that made things very, very difficult. And if you look at the chart that's there, this is from November 1764 to February 1766. You should recognize this from Sam Turner's article. It shows you the number of ships and their tonnage that visited St. Augustine. So you had, between this period, 9 sailings of ships between 10 to 15 tons, which is pretty small, 20 to 25 tons, 29 sailings, 30 to 35, you had 9, 40 to 45, 0, and you had 2 at 50 tons. Anything like 50-ton ships had to wait until high tide to come into the harbor, because they would literally ground themselves on the bar, on this area that I've marked up here that you can barely read anymore. Most of the ships were pretty small, but still, even those had to wait for high tide. It was always very smart to do that. And most of them would wait outside the harbor for a pilot, and you would hire a pilot to come from the city by boat out from the town through the harbor out into the ocean, and they would meet your ship, and they would get in onto the ship, and they would basically pilot your ship for you. If you had a pilot who had not been sailing for a while into St. Augustine, chances are he could ground your ship very easily, because one of the problems with the entrance to the harbor is that it was it changed very often, and it was very sandy. So if you didn't know the harbor very, very well, chances were that you would end up getting grounded. And if you got grounded, you either had to wait for high tide to rescue you, or you basically got screwed, and you had to wait for the ship to basically fall apart, which many of them did. Speaking of Floridians, what happens when these 3,500 subjects of Spain leave? So most of these people are Spaniards of different descent. You have a large number of slaves that go with them, or I'm sorry, excuse me, freed slaves. Because keep in mind, you had Fort Mose, which is the largest free settlement, and most of those residents came from British colonies, from the Carolinas and from Georgia. So if they come back under British control, what do you think is going to happen to them? They're going to get sold right back into slavery. So you have this large number of people coming out of St. Augustine. They identify themselves as Los Floridanos. They identify themselves as something different than just Spanish people. In 1764, a wealthy landowner in Cuba offered a big tract of land for the settlers to live on, and they called it San Agustin de la Nueva Florida. Um, and 84 of those displaced families moved there. This is the area down by Matanzas, right down here. And that's where most of the settlers, the Los Floridanos, moved. Unfortunately, the community ends up failing. It's not very productive land. They're not really able to make agriculture work, and so they end up moving back into Havana. But it's interesting that they create this kind of exile community made up of members of this self-identified group outside of Havana. And unfortunately, it just doesn't make a go. Excuse me. Okay, so West Florida. This is a map that we'll be looking at when we start talking about Spanish Florida in Spain Part 2, or the Second Spanish Period. So Spanish officials leave, they head to Havana or to Veracruz. They leave about 350 French residents in Mobile, because remember, Mobile is a city, it's been founded, but it was created under French control. And so you still have many French citizens still there. And then you have about 90 who are in the surrounding area. Johnston calls for elections for the Colonial Assembly, which is ironic because in East Florida, Grant does not call the General Assembly. The General Assembly is not called until 1781, which is after the American Revolution, or well, towards the end of the American Revolution. In terms of land grants, Johnston focuses on Germans, French and Swiss. He's looking for white settlers. And this is perfectly in line with what Parliament had recommended. The difference here, of course, is that you have New Orleans right down the road, which provides a great deal of trade, and would certainly be an advantage for any European that was looking to move into this territory, having New Orleans, which was really a commercial center in the Atlantic world, right down the road. Difference is West Florida doesn't do a very good job in terms of attracting a lot of residents to it, as much as East Florida does. One group, though, that does appear is this company of military adventurers. There's a General Phineas Lyman, who had fought in the French and Indian War, who gets together with a group of men, and they decide they're going to create this settlement made up of about 19 different townships, averaging about 23,000 acres each. And so they come to British West Florida, with the intention of creating this settlement. They begin to arrive in Pensacola. They move up the Mississippi River to begin their townships. Their numbers actually kind of dwindle a little bit, and they get delayed in terms of starting the settlement. And of course, by the time they actually get it going, the war, the American Revolution has begun. So in the long run, the only real land grant that comes out of this is Phineas Lyman for 20,000 acres. The others never really get it approved through the Crown. One of the towns that he does create, that Lyman does create, is called Natchez, Mississippi. Natchez becomes one of the wealthiest cities in the South in that period that I was talking about before, where you have the Cotton Belt and America begins to move into this territory. Natchez is one of the wealthiest towns, and we'll talk more about that. Well, actually, we won't talk about that because that's not even Florida, but it's kind of one of those interesting things that, you know, if you're on Jeopardy one day, you never know. So Pensacola, Johnson comes in. He discovers that it's in pretty bad shape. However, it does have a deep water port, which is something St. Augustine does not have. So he immediately begins drawing up a new plan for Pensacola, and Elias Sternford is the one he chooses to lay all of this out. As you can see in the map down here, there's a large fort in the center, and there's a big public area. This is common to Spanish cities. And the British end up keeping that, but then they plot everything off of that main square. So it's very well organized. He encourages settlers to come into town by offering them free land if they will build within the city of Pensacola. Indian policies differ between East and West Florida. Grant, again, does a very good job in terms of trying to reach out to the Indians and building this connection and relationship with them. He meets with the Indians at Fort Piccolata, which is right on the St. Johns River, just to the west, west of St. Augustine along the St. Johns River. He gains major concessions from the Creek and Seminoles, and they allow for settlements along the east coast of the St. Johns River. The other thing is Grant restricts planters and settlers from traveling through, from settling on native lands. He's very, very adamant about this. And this is something that obviously the Crown is very much in favor of as well. He also states that Indians can travel through British land in search of game. So if they are traveling, as long as they're traveling through the land and not staying, then they're okay. This is also the period when the Creek began to move from areas, what we would call Mississippi and Alabama today, into the central part of Florida. Two things to keep in mind. The Seminoles, or the Creeks, will become the Seminoles over time, but they're led through this territory by Chief Cowkeeper, and they end up settling around Gainesville in territory that had been occupied by the Timucua. The Timucua had pretty much died out through disease and other situations, but mostly through disease. And so this territory is wide open, available for another group or a group of Indians to come in, and of course they do. So if you look at the picture on the right, there are all these triangles. Those are major Creek, later Seminole settlements within the interior of Florida. And one thing to remember about the Creek, I forgot to mention this, is that they're very, very strong allies of the British. And the fact that the British take ownership of Florida is one of the reasons why they move in. The Creek also really hate the Americans, and so this is another reason why the Indians move into this territory. Is because they're already beginning to see large numbers of Americans that are beginning to settle in their territory, and they don't like it. So Florida offers an ally with the British, but it also offers protection because they're not going to be bothered with. Now, under Johnston, he has a different situation than what's in East Florida. Um, the British are heavily outnumbered, but they're also outnumbered by a larger variety of tribes. East Florida doesn't have the variety that West Florida does. In West Florida, you got the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek, and none of them get along. Um, you have the Creek and the Choctaw who literally are opposed to each other. And Johnston continually um, asked Parliament and the Crown for more soldiers, more protection. And he almost brings the colony to the brink of war with the Creek Nation before it's diffused and he's basically removed from power. Well, he gets frustrated and he ends up leaving. He applies for leave of absence, but basically he saw the writing on the wall that his time there was done. And so after he leaves 1767, he does not come back and the British government removes him. Here's a listing of the different governors of Florida. What's I think interesting is the number that West Florida ends up having versus East Florida. Um, you have in the very beginning the initial governors and the governors who are military. Um, Francis Ogilvie, for example, is a military ranking officer that comes in and serves as interim governor until Grant arrives. Once Grant leaves in 1771, you have Moultrie, who was the lieutenant governor, both under Grant and then later under Patrick Tonin. When Tonin comes in 1774, Moultrie goes back to being basically the lieutenant governor or deputy governor. West Florida is kind of a little bit more discombobulated. You have Johnston, who leaves in 1767. You have an acting governor. Then you have John Eliot, who comes in and spends probably a month. Um, Apparently, he had a brain tumor and he suffered from depression, but also a lot of health problems, and he ends up committing suicide. Um, and so Elias Durnford comes in, serves as acting governor, and then Peter Chester takes over. So it's kind of interesting to see the kind of turmoil or chaos that begins to develop within the leadership. Hopefully, you've heard of Turnbull's New Smyrna. This is the colony that developed. Andrew Turnbull was a doctor, but he traveled quite extensively and was very familiar with the Mediterranean area and decided that he wanted to create a colony in East Florida and use specific group of people called the Minorcans who lived on the island of Minorca to work on this plantation to be indentured servants. When he goes and begins to recruit these people, he actually ends up recruiting a lot of different people from around the Mediterranean. So there were Greeks, there were Jews, there were Turks, Italians, all types of people. But they're all kind of grouped under the name Minorcan, especially when you come to St. Augustine and you hear a lot about this. Basically, all of these people were Catholic. So they brought their own priest with them, Father Campos and Father Casanovas. During this plantation's run, Turnbull, puts a lot of money into this plantation. There are several structures that are still there, and there's a picture we'll look at on the next slide. But it just doesn't work out. Turnbull does not prove to be a very good leader, and the people, essentially the indentured servants, rebel. And so they leave the plantation, they come to St. Augustine, and by this time, Turnbull, who had a really good relationship with the first governor, Governor Grant, had a horrible relationship with the second governor, Governor Tonin. In fact, Turnbull wanted to be the new governor after Grant left, and it didn't work out. And so he tried to get Tonin fired. And so there's not a lot of love lost between the two men. So Tonin basically says to the refugees from New Smyrna, come settle in St. Augustine. I'll give you tracts of land, knowing full well that this meant the end of the plantation in New Smyrna and the failure of Turnbull's investments. Turnbull does go on. He's got a lot of money, so he's got a good cushion, but it does wreck his reputation quite badly. But this is where we, in St. Augustine at least, get a lot of very interesting food ways from the Menorcans, especially the datil pepper. Datil pepper is grown in North Florida, but it's very specific to St. Augustine. But you also have pilau, which is like a paella, almost rice dish with a bunch of stuff in it, and tortoise stew. The pictures here, there's a map of the settlement, which is not very good, but it does show you that it was very spread out along the river. There was a small kind of piece of land between the ocean and this river, and then you ran into the settlement, so it wasn't directly on the ocean. There are remnants of the pier, the canals. The statue is a statue of Father Campos. It's at the cathedral in St. Augustine. And he is the one that leads the refugees to St. Augustine. This is Turnbull's palace, so to speak. It is a solid structure that we have no idea what it was. Many people argue that it was Turnbull's home. It's way too large to be his home. Chances are it was some sort of storehouse or factory, but we're not really quite sure. Of course, there are no records from the plantation, so nobody really knows. As I mentioned, Tonin becomes the second governor. James Grant leaves London for health reasons. Tonin is brought in as the new governor. And as is customary, you have the Indians coming to the inauguration of Governor Tonin. And Tonin continues Grant's work to make sure that they have a solid relationship with the Indians. In December 1775, they sign a treaty at Treaty Oak at Calford, which, of course, Calford is today downtown Jacksonville. And it's an alliance between Great Britain, the Creeks, and the Seminoles. Tonin needed scouts. This, of course, is the beginning of the American Revolution, and he needed scouts and soldiers to help the British soldiers. And so this was one way of making sure that he had a ready supply. And of course, who better to be scouts than the natives who knew the land so well? With the beginning of the War of the Rebellion or the American Revolution, this proves to be a major disruption to the colony. You have privateering. Both American and British forces are using privateers to raid each other's ships. Trade is interrupted. Trade is very hazardous at this point in time, obviously because of privateers. Population shifts. You have loyalists who are fleeing from the American rebels as they capture different cities within the South. When Charleston falls and Savannah falls, St. Augustine goes from like a town of 500 people to a town of 3,000 people. So it quadruples and exponentially the number of people that are in the town. So you can imagine the chaos that a lot of that would create. And you also had raids. There were many raids within North Florida by Americans and vice versa. British would lead raids into Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina to raid plantations. So it meant a lot of damage, crop loss, and it could really wreck many of the plantations economically. So the Florida Rangers were formed by Tonin. This was his way of creating some sort of local protection. There were 7 companies of white soldiers and 3 companies of enslaved soldiers under white officers. They saw battle in Georgia. They entered Florida territory, or they would fend off Georgia military or militia who were coming into Florida territory. That didn't really flow very well. So in other words, the rebels were coming into the territory, they would fight back. They also ended up conducting raids back on American plantations. So it went back and forth, back and forth. February 1777, they captured Fort McIntosh in Georgia on the Satilla River. In 1778, they invaded Georgia and attacked yet another fort. They helped to capture the city of Savannah in 1778, and then also aid in the capture of Charleston. So you have this kind of back and forth thing that's going on with the Florida Rangers, but think of them as kind of a home guard type soldier. So when you have these large groups of people coming into the territory, some of them would stay, some of them would plan on only staying temporarily and then end up staying a little bit longer. But you had Savannah and Charleston bringing a large number of people into St. Augustine because they were close by. And in the event that the British were able to overturn um, the rebels and retake the city, then they could go back and reclaim their territory. Um, and it was just St. Augustine was in terms of proximity to the ocean, it was just a lot easier. Prior to 1782, Florida population was about 4,500, Minorcan population about 600, and then a black population of about 4,000, largely on the plantations. So in July 1782, you had 7,000 loyalists from Savannah and Charleston come into the harbor, and then another 3,800 come to Charleston by sea. Couple that with the treachery of the bay and getting into crossing the bar, as they say, into the harbor, and you have a huge number of shipwrecks that exist up and down around that area. And so there is the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum that is working to bring back a lot of these, or to unearth a lot of these shipwrecks, and they will go in and pull out cannon, as the picture below shows you. And they're on exhibit at the lighthouse. If you haven't had a chance to go and see their new exhibit wrecked, it shows a lot of the items that they've been able to pull out. Okay. Yeah. And then got a couple more slides. The St. Johns River plantations, as these refugees are coming into the territory, Tonin sees a great deal of opportunity, because if he can get these people to stay then and settle their plantation, not only is he getting the land into production, but he's also getting the tax revenue. And this is a great way to boost his status within the court. So Tonin encourages the British loyalists to stay, granting them land and giving them whatever they might need. And so you have a huge number of plantations that begin to line the St. Johns River. And there is a website that I will post a link to in the module, but basically it kind of shows you the blue marks are plantations, the green are land grants. So these are land grants that were not actually completed in terms of cultivated. They were given, and then the owner never did really anything with it. But you can see by the number of blue marks that there are quite a few plantations that line the river. And so this is an important element, because here was an opportunity where the colony was actually beginning to turn, and it was going to become a very wealthy colony. However, what happens? The British end up losing the American Revolution, and all of the British begin the exit out of the colony, and so it never comes to fruition. As part of the American Revolution, we had a number of South Carolina signers of the Declaration of Independence that were held in St. Augustine. Thomas Hayward Jr., Edward Rutledge, and Arthur Middleton, all from Charleston. And we also had Chris Gadsden, who was the one that created the Don't Tread on Me flag that's pictured. It's called the Gadsden flag. He was a leading patriot in South Carolina. And one of the things that's kind of funny is that Tonin inherits these prisoners. Lord Dunmore in South Carolina just basically ships them down to Tonin with a note that says, here, can you put these guys up in the fort? because the automatic inclination is, well, you got this big old fort, it's got to have a prison in it. Except that in many cases, Tonin didn't have the money to support, the citizens, let alone all these prisoners that Lord Dunmore was sending down from South Carolina. So in many cases, Tonin just released them or paroled them. But as many more began to come to flow in, Tonin couldn't do that. And so he either moved them to prison ships in the harbor, or he would allow them to be housed in the bishop's house, which sat next to the cathedral. So they weren't actually housed in the dungeons of the Castillo de San Marcos. And in fact, many of them were able to just walk through the city without any problem. And one of the very interesting things is that they were even allowed to host a 4th of July dinner for themselves. And it had a full course meal and festivities. Excuse me. Okay. So they had this big celebration for the 4th of July while they're sitting in British territory in a British held town during the American Revolution. So that's kind of a humorous aspect of it. So what ends up happening in West Florida during the American Revolution, Spain begins to enter British territory, enters the side of the war on the American side. They launch military attacks and slowly begin to move their way all the way to Pensacola by 1781. On October 19th, 1781, you have Lord Cornwallis surrender at Yorktown. Basically, the commander of British North American forces says, okay, we need to withdraw from Charleston, Savannah, St. Augustine, all of the East Coast areas. However, the withdrawal order for St. Augustine is rescinded. It's only later at the peace table that the British learn that they are actually going to be leaving Florida. And so at this point, Spain assumes the territory and the British begin to move out. And as I said, a lot of these subjects that have moved from Charleston to Savannah and have taken root along the St. Johns River and the plantations, even before they can really get things going, the rug is pulled out from under them pretty much. So at this point, we go directly into the Spanish territory and the Second Spanish period.